Hi, once again, it's your favorite history teacher, Mr. Thomas, and I'm here to bring you the second half of my presentation on the Age of Exploration, starting off with how the Spanish were able to conquer people that they met in the New World. They were establishing New Spain over here in the Americas. Now, in order to really get started on this, I want to minimize myself and put me up into the corner. There it is. Now, as you continue on with this, I want to show you about the Spanish conquistadors, which is just a fancy word that means conqueror. These guys were not out for exploration for the sake of finding new things. They wanted money. They were looking to get wealthy because of it. They risked their lives, they risked their men's lives in order to acquire as much gold as they possibly could and gain some fame. They were very, very vicious and used brutal tactics when doing so. But the end point was to get the money. Now, one of the groups that the conquistadors, and particularly Hernan Cortes, is going to go after are the Aztecs. The Aztecs had settled in what's now modern-day Mexico, and they were led by Moctezuma II. Now, typically, you hear people say Montezuma, kind of like the restaurant up there in Chambersburg, but I am going to say Moctezuma because that is a more appropriate way of saying his name. They established their capital city in central Mexico at a lake, and the city, of course, is Tenochtitlan. They were waiting for a vision that one of their priests had to come true. Now, the Aztecs were a nomadic people, but they were looking to settle. And one of their priests had a vision that said, when you see a eagle land on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, that is the spot to create their city. And that actually comes true. And you can see that down here at the bottom in this picture, where you got a cactus and an eagle and a snake in his mouth. They will conquer local tribes, except for one that they use as kind of a staging ground to grab human sacrifices. The local tribes, of course, will hate the Aztecs because they are hunted down for sacrifices and they will be taxed heavily. The Aztecs are going to create enemies that will come back and bite them later on. And I don't mean Hernan Cortes. Their human sacrifices were rather vicious. They would bring people up, sometimes as many as 250,000 in a year. Some of their ceremonies would call for the killing of 20,000 people, for example. They'd bring people up to the top of one of their pyramids, where an Aztec priest will use an obsidian knife in order to cut open a person down in their abdomen, and then they would reach in and grab their heart. I know, it's just as nasty as it sounds. And if they pulled that heart out quick enough, which they were rather skilled at, that heart would still be beating in their hands. Anyway, you'll notice here where their capital city is, right there at that lake. And notice that there are a couple of patches here that have not been conquered by the Aztecs on purpose. But again, foreshadowing. It's going to come back. This city of theirs is huge. It was as large or larger than most European cities at the time period. They would have this lake that is surrounding it, and they built these causeways that are kind of like bridges. They just built up the ground so that the land would be above the water and they could bring people in and out of them. These causeways are going to be the access points for the cities. Now, they would even do things like set up farming areas where they would have these large rafts that they would be able to grow some of their crops on. And you could see a little teeny bit of that in this picture right down in here and over in here and in here. But it was amazing. The conquistadors that are going to see this city could not believe the size, the organizational structure, and the defensive nature of having a city on an island with causeways that you can block off. It's impressive. Hernan Cortes was born in Spain, and he's going to travel first to Cuba, and he's going to establish himself there. He actually becomes one of the leading Spaniards in the city of Santiago. But he sells everything that he has in order to outfit an expedition to go and conquer the Aztec people. Now, he goes and ends up having about 600 guys under his control, but the story is a little bit more exciting and nuanced than that. He goes and he actually finds himself a Spanish priest that had been shipwrecked and had learned a local Mayan language. He also finds, from his activities after he conquers a group of people, a young woman named La Malinke. and she's going to be able to translate some Mayan and Aztec. And so through this chain of translations for the priest and his woman, you're going to have him being able to kind of choppily talk to some Aztec people as he's getting closer. The Aztecs didn't quite know what to make of him. They thought he might be a returning god, Quetzalcoatl, but they're not sure. They would like him to just simply go away. Hernan Cortez does not. When he comes into Tenochtitlan, he will be amazed, but he will also very quickly take Moctezuma hostage. And he will use Moctezuma in order to get the gold and silver and other riches that he wants. Now, it doesn't work out perfectly. The Aztecs are going to rise up when Hernan Cortez leaves to go to the coast and deal with an issue there. They are going to rise up. Cortez has to come back, save his Spanish friends, fight his way out of the city. But this is the point I was talking about earlier. What had happened is Cortez will ally himself with other native groups. And these other native groups hate the Aztecs because of the human sacrifices and because of those heavy taxes. And Cortez and his 600 guys, it seems impossible for them to take over a society of millions. It's because they weren't alone. They had lots of help from their native allies, and that is what's going to help them overcome the Aztecs. And not to mention smallpox. That plays a huge role as well. You can see images like this one of the fights. You can also see how the Spanish had superior weapons, their swords, their armors, guns, small cannons called falconets that they would have with them. Horses alone, that was something that the Aztecs had never seen. It's an old world thing coming over to the New World, then Columbian exchange. And the Aztecs weren't even sure if men on horseback were people riding an animal or just one weird kind of creature that was out there. They learned very quickly what the truth was, but they also got trampled during a lot of this. The native allies are going to help out tremendously in diseases, smallpox, measles, mumps, but especially smallpox is going to ravage the Aztec warriors and the rest of the Aztec people for that matter. That disease that Europeans do have some resistance to, but the natives of the Americas did not, is going to devastate millions. And the fact that the Aztecs were a little unsure about Cortez and even thought he is a god, that combined with some brutal tactics would make the Aztecs hesitate, something that was a mistake. On the other hand, the Aztecs, they had some impressive weapons, but they did not have the steel. They did not have the kinds of armor that the Spanish would have. And they had very little resistance to these new diseases. But I do love some of the Aztec-style weapons like this one down here. You can see this thing is about the size of a cricket bat. It has obsidian points and blades that are embedded into the sides right here. The stories that the Spanish would even write would say that a solid Aztec warrior could take a swing with one of those clubs and behead a horse, let alone cut a man in half. These weapons maybe not hold up to Spanish steel or Spanish musket fire, but they are rather unique. I like pictures like this one, and I would highly recommend kind of looking at this in a segmented fashion because you can see the story of the conquest of the Aztecs and other native groups for that matter in here. If you take a look at this thing in quadrants and you kind of cut it in half one way and cut it in half in the other, and you're looking along those things in this upper left hand side, you can see the enslavement of natives that are coming through here. You can even see these guys that are pulling that are yoked up to this particular plow and are pulling it along. You can see a Spanish priest trying to do some conversions. You can see what will happen with the resistance, and they will have hanging bodies back here. They will also have the miners because the Spanish were interested in the gold and the silver. If you look at the bottom quadrant down here, you can see parts of the Columbian exchange and some of the different animals that are available. You got pigs over here, and you got a donkey, and you got some goats, and you can even see this Spaniard right here is doing a trade with another Spaniard over on this side, kind of in the bottom center. They're writing it down on a ledger. You got some mercantilism that's taking place here as well. This Spaniard that's on the left-hand side of your screen, he has a baby over here, and his wife is carrying this thing down here. You can see that mixing of the races already. This upper right hand corner, you can see the cross. And you've got a native person here. I know it kind of looks like a blue blob, but it is a native person. You can see the head and the feathers on his head band. And this blue blob is kind of a blanket that's down here. And notice that the priest is right there to give him a blessing. There's also the sword right here. It's probably a forced conversion. Down at the bottom, you can see some of the horrific treatment of the native people. You can see Aztecs enslaved, their heads are down, they're not looking too good, and this guy, of course, has his hands tied behind his back, his feet are going to be shackled, and they are doing something rather unspeakable to him. Inspired by guys like Hernan Cortez, Francisco Pizarro is going to hear about a group to the south. Now, this group is in South America, very far south of the Aztecs, but he's going to hear about the Incas. And he is going to go down there with about 200 men and conquer an entire empire. He had a couple of lucky things going for him. Number one, he had the example set by Cortez, and how Cortez was able to capture Moctezuma, hold him as hostage. That is something that Pizarro will duplicate down there with the Incan people. And he will capture Atahualpa and hold him for ransom. He does eventually execute, after the ransom is paid, of course, he does eventually execute the Incan leader. He is able to conquer an entire empire with just a few hundred men because that Incan empire had just gotten done a civil war. Atahualpa had just fought and defeated his brother. And so the empire was at a weak stage to begin with, let alone the fact that smallpox had already preceded Pizarro and had started to weaken the Incan people through the devastation of that particular disease. You can see here some of the objects of art and some of the other skills that Incas had. Their empire is going to stretch along the Pacific coastline of South America. A rare artifact right here in the upper right-hand corner is a piece of Incan goldwork inlaid with some gems. This kind of stuff typically got melted down as it was going to be shipped off to Spain. It's rare to find something like that, or this one in the center. This girl in the middle, she is an Incan mummy. And they did mummify people, not in the same way that Egyptians did. They did not wrap them up with linens and stuff like that, but they would have them tied up in almost a fetal position, stuck into baskets, and put at such high altitudes that it would stop the process of decomposition. But Incan stonework is some of the most impressive on the planet. You can see down here at the bottom two wonderful pictures of it. This one rock, I had the people in there for scale, so you can see how well they would carve these things out and how intricately they would fit into one another like a puzzle. They did all this without using any kind of mortar or cement. These are just stacked rocks, nothing else. And the seams are so tight on them, you can't even get a knife blade through to them. As I was saying, Atahualpa had just won a bloody civil war against his brother. Pizarro had met him, and Atahualpa had some many men with him, but he was overconfident. What Pizarro had done was station his guys hidden in some buildings, and they went into this courtyard. And what had happened is the Aztecs, the Spanish were able to seal off the exits to this courtyard. And when they do eventually hear the right words to start blowing away the Incas, they would fire some of their muskets, they would fire their small cannons, and then they would rush out with horses on a cavalry charge. And this is stuff that the Incans had never seen before. And in that chaos, the Spanish were able to capture their leader. They held him for a ransom, and this ransom was, well, just immense. Nice little picture, not exactly what it looked like, but it's a nice little picture of what the meeting could have been. Notice this picture right here, ransom and death. When Atahualpa was captured, he promised Pizarro that his people would fill up a room 22 feet by 17 feet, once with gold and twice with silver. That is tons of gold and silver. You can even see some of these pictures down here of how high it would get stacked in the room and how happy the Spanish are to see all of this stuff coming in. It took months to get this together. And in that time, well, they would have the Spanish kick back and relax as the ransom is getting paid and they're able to get all this stuff from the Incas. The leader was captured and he would be forced to tell people of his that they would have to go ahead and bring the Spanish food and water and all sorts of stuff. When it was finally paid, well, Pizarro has him executed. And you can even see that in this upper picture right here. Rope around his neck, piece of wood into there, and twist it around until he's strangled. One of the places that is a must-see on this planet, it's on my bucket list, is Machu Picchu. This is an area that was once a temple complex for young Aztec women that were worshiping a sun god of theirs. It eventually kind of morphs into a last bastion where the, did I say Aztecs? I meant to say Incas. My apologies. Where the Incas would hold out as the Spanish are trying to look for any last pockets of resistance. This is on top of a mountain. It is spectacular for the views and everything else, but it has some great other works on here. It was a lost city rediscovered in 1911. Matter of fact, the American that rediscovers this city is the really rough basis for Indiana Jones. Of course, every teacher's favorite. Every history teacher. They use terrace farming, which you can see these kinds of step structures that are out there so they can plant some food that is up there. In order to get the topsoil, they would have the Incans that would carry, in essence, backpacks full of topsoil from the bottom of the valley up there into these mountain terraces and dump the topsoil in there. Lots of mummies of the Incan women had been found around here, which makes sense because it was a spot for priestesses for many, many years before it was one of those last pockets of resistance. Now, for all of this age of exploration, countries had to make money from exploring, or otherwise it wasn't going to be worth it. Now, you could do that in a couple of different ways, and this is some of the ways that I'm going to talk about. One of them is establishing a new trade route, like the Portuguese had done when they sailed southward around the continent of Africa and up to India. That new trade route was going to cut out the middlemen, and they were going to be able to make a lot of cash off of that. You could also conquer local population, take their gold and their silver and their other valuables. Spain does this with both Cortez conquering the Aztecs and Pizarro conquering the Incas. You could also enslave the local population and grow cash crops on plantations. Many countries did this, including the French with their sugar plantations in the Caribbean and the British with tobacco plantations, as well as sugar plantations and eventually cotton plantations, Americans too. And each one of these has its own unique characteristics. The new trade route is probably the quickest, but the hardest to hold on to long term. Conquering the local population and taking their gold and silver takes a little teeny bit more time. It's certainly a lot more dangerous, but there's only so much gold and silver that they have already dug out of the earth, and afterwards you're getting into some pretty complex mining and enslaving a local population anyway. But when you enslave the local population and grow cash crops, it's the hardest to get started, but it's the most long-lasting, and that lasts for 400 to 500 years. During this time, a new economic policy of mercantilism rises up, where nations' power depends upon its wealth. And the idea was there's only so much wealth on the planet, so you had to get as much gold as possible so that you would be stronger and therefore more powerful than everybody else. And one of the ways to do that was to establish a favorable balance of trade, which simply put only means one thing. You want to make sure that you export from your country as much as possible while importing the least. Now, to make up for that disparity of too many exports and too few imports, the countries that are importing will have to supplement that with gold. So the more self-sufficient that you can become, the less you have to rely on imports, the more that you can establish a favorable balance of trade. There are some other countries that are involved. For example, the Dutch, always involved in money-making opportunities when they can. They established the Dutch East India Company, and you can see their wonderful logo here. It looks like a letter V with an OC on there. Upwards of 20,000 ships These guys are a powerhouse of trade for a long period of time. They will control the Spice Islands. They're able to take that away from the Portuguese. The Dutch are also the one European country that trades with both China and Japan after each one of those nations isolate themselves. The French are also going to establish a colonial empire. They control a lot of territory along the St. Lawrence River and also down into the Mississippi River Valley. And with that, they're going to be fur trading experts. The French create a fur trade empire. And you can see this blue structure right here, this blue blob on the map right here, how the French are able to really connect New Orleans up through Quebec, through river systems, and trade a lot of animal skins, especially beaver pelts. And the English, of course, control territory along the Atlantic and in the Caribbean. Eventually, the English are going to fight a war with the French and be able to take Canada away from them. Of course, eventually, the Americans are going to fight a war with the English and take the 13 colonies and start America. The English, instead of being backed to 100% by the government like Spain and Portugal had done, they create these joint stock companies where investors can pool some of their money, and then each one will have just the amount of money that they put into it at risk. And by put into it, I mean put into establishing a colony and outfitting an expedition to the New World. Jamestown is a good example of that. How can this be summarized? Well, basically, the Age of Exploration happens between 1450 and about 1650. Spanish and the Portuguese are the ones that really take the lead, and the Spanish tended to go west to the Americas. The Portuguese tended to go east to Africa, India, Spice Islands. Why? Getting the trade routes, trying to push for the gold, God, and glory, trying to make their mark on history, convert people, and also just simply curiosity. Things that made this possible included new kinds of ships like the caravel. Square sails would give them power. Lateen sails would give them the ability to tack into the wind. Large rudders would make these ships more maneuverable to go around sandbars and shoals. New aids to navigation like the sextant, the astrolabe, the compass, all these things would make it possible. Consequences for the native people are, simply put, not good. A lot of their culture, their civilizations are going to be destroyed, let alone the loss of life. Gold, silver, other valuables are going to be taken from them and shipped back to Europe, and millions of people are going to die from disease and slave-like labor. Not even slave-like labor, slavery. Europe gets rich. Mercantilism works for them, and they also start seeing this opportunity to make money off of the slave trade. More on that a little bit later. But through the Columbian Exchange, they're getting new products. The potatoes and the corn, tomatoes, stuff like that is coming back to Europe, and the Europeans are going to acquire a taste for these new foods. Of course, war is going to break out. This much money being made, European powers are going to fight one another over it. And, of course, the migration of people.